Santarsiero, a resident of Lower Mickfield, Pennsylvania, is an advocate for gun safety. He's the prime sponsor of Pennsylvania General Assembly House Bill 1010, which would require background checks to be conducted on all firearm purchases. Santarsiero also is running for a seat in the U.S. Congress representing Pennsylvania's 8th Congressional District, comprised of Bucks County and portions of Montgomery County. Representative?
Thank you. And let me first apologize for getting here a little late this evening. We had another commitment that ran a little late, so I apologize for that. And I'm sorry, Captain Grant, that I missed part of your presentation. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure finally to make it to Har Sinai. I have known many members of the congregation over the years, but this is actually the first time, after seeing it many times going up and down Route 31, the first time I've actually been here, so it's a pleasure to be here. I am Steve Santarsiero, and I represent the 31st District, and I know there are probably a number of people here tonight who live in the 31st District. I'm just curious, by a show of hands, how many of you are in the Yardley Newtown area of Bucks County? Okay, so fair number. And how many Pennsylvania residents here tonight? Okay, so also a fair number. It's interesting that Captain Grant ended on that note, comparing New Jersey to Pennsylvania. There's quite a difference when you cross that river, at least with respect to the issue of gun safety. And you know, we could talk about a far wide range of issues tonight when it comes to gun safety, but I'm going to confine my remarks to a very narrow issue, and that is the issue of background checks. And I'll try to stay a little bit further away from this microphone because I'm hearing feedback. I don't know if you do. Just to kind of give you a sense of where things are in Pennsylvania, we have existing today a fairly good background check system and a fairly good background check law. In fact, it's currently better than the one that was being considered under the Toomey Manchin bill down in Washington. It covers every transaction other than the private sale of so-called long guns, and it also doesn't deal with inter-family transfers of firearms. We have an instant check system in Pennsylvania that is better than the national instant check system. And I refer to the national instant check system by the acronym NICS, and in Pennsylvania, ours is PICS, the Pennsylvania Instant Check System. It's very comprehensive in terms of the felony and criminal history that it covers, as well as the mental illness history that it covers that would trigger someone not being eligible to be able to purchase a firearm. So under the current law, other than those two exceptions that I described, you go and purchase a firearm, and you have to have a background check done. And the vast majority of those background checks are done in NIDS, and it's not a real burden on anyone. House Bill 1010, as we originally wrote it and as it was originally introduced back in the previous session, in the wake of the horrible tragedy in Newtown, Connecticut, would merely do away with the exception with respect to long guns. So essentially, anytime someone went in to purchase a firearm, whether it was a handgun or a long gun, they would have to have a background check done. Now, what is a long gun? A long gun is a rifle or a shotgun. It's a gun over a certain barrel length. So, for example, you're at a gun show, you're in a parking lot, you decide if you meet someone and they want to sell you a rifle, you would have to go in front of a licensed dealer to have that transaction happen so that licensed dealer could actually do the background check. Or if you're just doing it between two individuals anytime in the community, you would have to go to either a licensed dealer or the county sheriff and have the background check done. Pretty simple. In the last session, the 2013-2014 session, we had 66 co-sponsors of this legislation, and let me just explain to you what that means. I am the prime sponsor of the bill. That means I'm the one who wrote the bill and introduced the bill. The co-sponsors are my colleagues who on hearing about the idea of this bill being presented, decide that they want to put their name on it as well as a sign of support. And it's a pretty significant thing, because when you co-sponsor a bill, you're publicly saying, I agree with that idea, I agree with this proposed legislation. But more than that, you're telling your other colleagues within the legislature that this is a good idea and they should support it too. And generally speaking, the more co-sponsorship you build over time, the harder it is to ignore the issue. And hopefully you eventually get to a point where the leadership decides that this is a bill that should be brought forward and given a vote. Now, legislatures are by their nature leadership driven because they're so big. And in Pennsylvania, we have one of the largest state legislatures in the country. We have 203 members in the House, and we have 50 members in the Senate. And I happen to believe that both chambers should be reduced in size, but we're not going to have that debate tonight. So it becomes even more important in a large legislature, the role of the leadership, because they have that much more power when there are that many more members. So the battle here, as it is with any piece of legislation, is getting the leadership to agree to move the bill, first through committee and then ultimately onto the floor and bring it up for a vote. So getting those co-sponsors is an important step in trying to hopefully to convince them to do that. So we had 66 co-sponsors. 7 of those co-sponsors were Republicans. Most of them came from Delaware County, which, if you're familiar with the geography around Philadelphia, is the suburban county just to the west of Philadelphia. One of them came from Montgomery County, which is between Delaware and Bucks, where I live. Not a bad start. When a piece of legislation came up toward the end of that session in the fall of 2014, this was a bill that the NRA was pushing that ultimately was amended into another piece of legislation that had absolutely nothing to do with the bill that the NRA was pushing, which was a bill essentially to give the NRA standing to sue municipalities if they enacted local ordinances which they deemed inconsistent with the state law. We tried to amend my bill into that NRA provision, and we got, I believe it was 64 votes, if I'm not mistaken, but my chief of staff, Rose, will correct me if I'm wrong. So we actually got a few fewer votes than the people who were sponsoring the bill. Most of those votes were from Democrats, but not all. Some of the Republicans who had sponsored the bill voted for it. A couple of other Republicans voted for it as well. I tell you all that by way of background, just to kind of set the terrain. Now, in Pennsylvania, gun safety is not such a strict partisan issue, because there are a lot of Democrats, particularly from the western part of the state, who belong to the so-called gun rights caucus. And these are, generally speaking, people who are not inclined to support gun safety legislation, with some exceptions. But even our own Democratic leadership is disinclined to bring gun safety legislation to the floor. So it's a little bit of a challenge, because you're dealing not just with a reluctant Republican leadership, which you might expect to be the case, but also some of the Democratic leadership as well. This session, we reintroduced House Bill 1010. And this time we have 64 co-sponsors, and 9 of those are Republicans. So we gained a couple of Republicans. We actually lost 1 or 2 Democrats. But it's about where we were before. We're continuing to try to build more co-sponsorship, and our community advocates are trying to do the same thing, and they're doing a terrific job, I might add. We changed the bill a little bit to try to get more co-sponsors, and particularly those who had concerns who aligned more with the gun rights caucus. What did we do? We inserted a provision in the bill that said, essentially, if you go to a gun show and you get a background check done in front of one dealer, it's good for 48 hours for every transaction you do in front of that dealer. And we reasoned, along with a number of the stakeholders, that this was something that was, I think, a reasonable compromise to make, because frankly, there weren't too many things that were going to make their way into the PIC system within a 48-hour period, and frankly, if someone had committed a felony or were arrested or had some involuntary commitment to a mental institution in that period, they wouldn't be buying a weapon anyway, so it didn't seem as if it really was something that materially changed the bill. But at the end of the day, we were able to get a few more folks to join on, including some of those Western Democrats who were reluctant to do so before. So, where are we now? Well, we are still battling to try to get more support for this bill to a point where hopefully we'll be able to really put pressure on the leadership on both the Democratic and Republican side to bring the bill up. We have in the past had at least one hearing on the issue of background checks generally, not this bill particularly, because the Republican chair of the Judiciary Committee, where the bill was sent, didn't want to have a hearing on the bill per se, but he was okay with having it on the issue of background checks. And for that, we had two of the moms from Sandy Hook come and testify. Francine Wheeler, who was originally from Bucks County, and Nicole Hockley. And I can tell you that day when they went to testify in Harrisburg, you would not be surprised to hear that there was not a dry eye in the entire room. But I'm sad to say that that did not result in the chairman of the committee being willing to bring the bill up for a vote. We need to continue to work, and it's not going to be an easy fight, and these things seldom are an easy fight. But one of the things we have to do is get past the rhetoric and explain exactly what this legislation is about. And I'll give you an example of what we're up against in that regard. About 3 years ago, we had a gun safety rally in Morrisville, Pennsylvania, down by the Little League fields next to the levee by the river. It was really designed as an effort to get local people who supported gun safety to come out and voice their support for reasonable gun safety legislation, and to hear from advocates as well. Well, not surprisingly, a lot of the folks who are part of the NRA found out about this, and
You weren't there.
No, you weren't. In fact,
NRA wasn't there. I mean,
well,
you have fringe actors on this whole.
if I
Yeah.
may.
We weren't there.
Are you the NRA?
So I'm on a board committee of the NRA, and I represent the NRA in court, and I'm not here in my official capacity.
All right. Well, you were not there, and whether the NRA was officially or unofficially is immaterial to the point that I'm about to make. The people who were there were clearly people who had come to voice their opposition to House Bill 1010, who had come to voice their opposition to any gun safety legislation. They had their weapons with them. They had bullhorns. They even had a few signs that said Santarsiero was a communist. I think communist was misspelled, but that's another issue. And they were protesting, and they were, we're sitting up here in the Bema, and let's say this is the stage in Morrisville, and I'm standing here. They were about where these ladies are sitting right now with their bullhorns. And as you might imagine, and you can Google this, I think you'll find a video from this, it's still there. There's a video of me speaking, and then former Governor Rendell was there, and a number of other people. I made my speech. I explained what House Bill 1010 was. I basically explained everything I just told you, and went and sat down. The rally ended. I was walking back to my car in the parking lot, and this guy pulls up past me in his pickup truck, and on the back of the pickup truck on the window is this big NRA decal emblazoned. He must have recognized me because the truck stops, and then I see his reverse lights come on, and he starts backing up, and I think, okay, this might not go well. He comes back right next to me, rolls down the window, and said, "Why are you trying to take my guns away?" And I said, "I'm not trying to take your guns away." He said, "Yes, you are. You're here trying to take my guns away." I said, "I'm not trying to take your guns away. I respect your right to own your firearm." "Well, what is your bill doing?" "That's what it's trying to do." I said, "That's not what it's doing. I happen to have it right here. It's all 3 sentences long. Most of it is a deletion mark in the current law. Take a look." He read through it. He looked up at me, and he said, "Oh, well, that's reasonable." I said, "Exactly. And if you'd been listening for the last hour and a half, you would have come to that conclusion before." And the reason I say that is because there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of shouting that goes on back and forth. And we need to break through the shouting, and and we need to break through the misinformation, and we need to explain what it is that we're trying to do. And I think when you get to that point, you start to realize that that polling data that says, even in a state like Pennsylvania, where 90% of the respondents to the polls say they're in favor of universal background checks, and nearly the same number of gun owners in Pennsylvania are in favor of universal background checks, you suddenly start to realize that there is really broad consensus on some of these issues. But we have to break through the rhetoric. Now, why doesn't it move in the legislature when there are those types of numbers and there are likely that real number of supporters out there among the populace? Why? Well, because the NRA, I'm not talking about the Blue Eagle, the National Recovery Administration, but the National Rifle Association, has a lot of political heft, particularly in a state like Pennsylvania. And there are a lot of members in both the House and the Senate who don't want to cross them. And I can tell you, I'm the chair of the Democrats' Southeastern delegation, which basically covers the collar counties around Philadelphia, plus a couple of other members from the central part of the state who don't have anywhere else to go. So they're Democrats in the middle of a sea of red, so they join us. And we and the Philadelphia delegation had a meeting together with representatives of the National Rifle Association about a year and a half ago, just to discuss the issue, just to see whether we could get to some meeting of the minds. And in the course of that conversation, it very quickly became clear that we weren't going to be able to do that, and we weren't going to be able to do that because the representatives of the NRA essentially admitted, when you got down to it, that not only did they not support closing this last loophole, but frankly, if they had their druthers, there wouldn't be any background checks at all. And I have to tell you something. We have a law that prohibits certain classes of people who are defined in the statute from being able to purchase a firearm. How can you possibly enforce that law if you don't have background checks? And if you have an organization that's advocating for gun rights that ultimately doesn't believe that we should have background checks, and maybe you'll tell me something else in just a moment, and that's fine if the organization is actually taking a different position, I'm happy to hear it. But those two gentlemen who were with us that day were basically saying, man, we shouldn't even, really, it'd be better not to have them. How do you get to a point where you can have a reasonable dialogue? So we have our work cut out for us. We have our work cut out for us in Pennsylvania. We have our work cut out for us in the United States. We need to get to a point where reasonable people can sit down and have a conversation and reach a compromise and get these things done. And let me just say this, because I hear this all the time. Well, background checks are not going to stop Newtown, Connecticut. Background checks aren't going to stop Columbine. There is no other area of policy in this, the Garden State, the Keystone State, or anywhere else in the United States where we hold our legislative work or our regulatory work up to a standard of perfection. No other area. But consistently, when it comes to gun safety, that's the argument that's made. It's not an honest argument. Just because something's not foolproof doesn't mean you don't do it. The existence of stop signs or traffic lights don't stop every idiot from creating an accident, right? Don't stop every mistake. But we still have them because we recognize that they have an impact. And in the case of long guns, if you think it's not that significant an issue in Pennsylvania that there's no background check when it comes to the private purchase of long guns, well, the fact of the matter is that the rate of homicides committed with long guns is increasing in Pennsylvania. that the rate of homicides, the rate of killings of law enforcement officers with long guns is increasing in Pennsylvania. That while the majority of homicides are still committed with handguns, those rates are higher than they were 10 years ago, and in certain areas, more rural areas, they're even higher. So it does matter. And no, it's not going to stop every instance of violence. It's not going to stop every homicide, but it can have an impact. It's reasonable. It's enforcing the existing law, which the legislature has already decided by its passage is the right policy for the state. We ought to have